Hello, everyone, and warm greetings from Chicago. As Melanie stated, my name is Danny Martin. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In this presentation, I'll be addressing the question, is the future of mathematics education Black? My decision to frame the future of mathematics education in the United States in this way is partially shaped by my positionality as a Black man in America. In this country, I belong to a group whose bottom level status in the social hierarchy has been fortified in law, policy, practice, and reform for more than 400 years. The last 18 months of extrajudicial killings of Black people by police, the disproportionate effects of COVID-19, and efforts to disenfranchise Black voters serve as visible reminders of this bottom level status. While many people across the globe may have been shocked by the recent killings of Black people by American police or by the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black people, the year 2020 was in many respects completely normal for Black people. The data projected in these two graphics are not aberrations. Going back 10, 20, or even 100 years would reveal similar outcomes in many different areas of Black life. Therefore, my thoughts about the future of mathematics education cannot ignore the realities of the past and the present, and they cannot be confined to issues of teaching, learning, curriculum, or assessment. Against the backdrop of these observations, let me say a bit more about the title of my talk. My claim today is that there is no future for mathematics education in the United States if a reimagined mathematics education does not value the lives and humanity of Black people, contribute to their collective liberation and flourishing, and stand in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. If not, the future of mathematics education will continue to reflect the past and the present. In America, the past and the present reflect the fact that despite decades of curriculum and teaching reform, many Black children continue to experience dehumanizing and violent forms of mathematics education. These dehumanizing and violent experiences are rooted in systems of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, invoking white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism should not be viewed as unnecessary provocation. Historical analysis shows that they are foundational to the birth of America, and they continue to undergird almost every American institution. In many ways, white supremacy is a thread that holds America together, stitching together the past, the present, and the future. Invoking anti-Blackness provides a necessary language to explain the particularities of Black oppression and the willingness of American institutions to dehumanize Black people and inflict gratuitous violence. Also, racial capitalism helps to explain how Black pain, Black suffering, and fabrications of Black pathology continue to serve as commodities for capital accumulation. During chattel slavery, for example, the bodies of Black people were considered property, and their free labor generated much of America's wealth. More than 150 years later, the marginalization of Black people in mathematics has resulted in a proliferation of what I would call intervention economies, focused on fixing Black learners and increasing their achievement and participation in mathematics. The persistence of Black racial oppression in America over the past 400 years also serves as a reminder that white supremacy is a self-correcting system that has resisted every effort to dismantle it. As noted by the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, white supremacy is a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. And so we must imagine a new country. In my opinion, if America cannot be reformed away from white supremacy, then the same is true for mathematics education. I can modify the quote from earlier to say, white supremacy is a force so fundamental to mathematics education that it is difficult to imagine mathematics education without it. And so we must imagine a new mathematics education. Also, confronting the realities of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism in mathematics education also means confronting the myths and realities of Black inclusion and the myths that are perpetuated about reform. This slide shows that after steady increases from the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the percentage of Black mathematics majors, represented by the red curve, has actually decreased during the past 25 years and stabilized to around 5%. This time frame from the late 1980s to the current time coincides with several mathematics education reforms in the US. Many of these reforms focused on issues of diversity and inclusion. This next slide shows that over the same time frame, the number of Black mathematics majors at US universities, represented by the blue curve, has remained relatively flat. So in the context of these two curves at least, Black inclusion into mathematics is actually a myth. My research and the work of several colleagues has documented other realities and material consequences of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism for Black learners in math education. In very recent work, we discuss how Black learners encounter and negotiate various forms of violence, including epistemological violence, systemic violence, and symbolic violence. For example, we show how knowledge production often reifies the idea of Black inferiority in mathematics by using statistics as a proxy for truth. Drawing on the work of Thomas Teo, we frame this as epistemological violence. We also show how school-based mathematical practices limit Black students' access to identities as creators and doers of mathematics, often reserving these identities for white and Asian learners. We link these practices to symbolic violence. Next, consider this study published in 2014. It was a longitudinal analysis of mathematics placement profiles of Black students and white students from late elementary school through 8th grade. The authors analyzed the impact of teacher evaluation of student performance versus student demonstrated performance on the odds of being placed into algebra in the 8th grade. Please note that in the United States, algebra serves as an important gateway and gatekeeper course to more advanced mathematics and other prized educational opportunities. Results of the study revealed that Black students had reduced odds of being placed in algebra by the time they entered 8th grade, even after controlling for performance in mathematics. The odds of placement in algebra by 8th grade for Black students were reduced by 2/3 to 2/5 compared to their white peers. The authors concluded, Black students confront an untenable impediment in that their Blackness, or as we suggest here, the teacher's implicit responses to these students' Blackness, is an invisible obstacle to gaining access to high-level mathematics courses, irrespective of their demonstrated performance. In other words, meeting and exceeding standards are not enough to counterbalance anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Now, let me be clear that I'm not making an argument for inclusion into mathematics as it currently stands. If inclusion means inclusion into a system that's fundamentally anti-Black, I cannot support that. So building back better and reform post-2020 must mean more than inclusion into mathematics as it is. Rather, the focus should be on building a humane, anti-racist mathematics education free of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, why is mathematics education in the US not stood in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism? Let me make this claim. And I want to claim that math education reforms in the US have always been aligned with political projects promoting white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism, along with a number of other social forces. What is the evidence for this claim? This table is a very simple depiction showing how various math education reforms in the US have co-evolved with the prevailing political and racial projects. In a recent paper, I provide a more detailed analysis of how the political and racial projects in column 3 have always enlisted the math education reforms promoted in column 1. Likewise, the reforms in column 1 have always supported the prevailing racial and political projects in column 3. For example, the new math reforms of the 1950s and 60s unfolded at the same time that America was in the midst of legalized racial segregation. Those new math reforms were not intended for Black Americans, and there is no historical evidence that math education stood in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. More than 70 years later, US math education is in the midst of what we call here the Common Core reform era, and America at large finds itself entangled in the racial politics that led to the election of Donald Trump, the Black Lives Matter movement, COVID, white supremacist insurrection, and the transition to the Biden presidency. Now, given the accumulation and persistence of racial and political projects in column 3 and ongoing commitments to reform, what is the future of math education? So rather than asking, is the future of mathematics education Black? I now suggest that the future of mathematics education in the US at least must be Black. Math education in the United States has no future if it does not value the lives and humanity of Black people and contribute to their collective liberation and flourishing. There must be an agenda to build Black futures and forms of math education that stand in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. Now, before closing this presentation, I want to acknowledge that the realities of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism in America do not map neatly onto other locations around the globe. Even in those contexts where race is socially and politically significant, such as South Africa and Brazil. However, the meanings, processes, and material consequences of race and racism are different in these 3 locations, for example. However, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism are still very salient in all 3 locations. Let me also be clear that even in those contexts where it is believed that race is not an issue because, quote, there are no Black people here, unquote, critical questions can and should be raised. Some of those questions appear here, and I invite you to engage with them after the presentation. I also want to leave this presentation with a couple of other questions here that may come up for conversation and discussion. Given that many reform movements ultimately uphold the status quo, is it possible to reform math education in America so that it stands in opposition to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism? And also, what do radically reimagined futures of math education that center the needs of the socially, politically, and economically disadvantaged and marginalized people look like? And this applies to across the globe. So with these questions, I'll end my presentation and say thank you for your patience and look forward to the conversation.